watching Veracity Hill. Here is your host, Dr. J.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on the authorship of the Gospels. That's our subject for today's episode. Last week was a lot of fun with my ministry partner, David Montoya, as we looked at awful atheist admissions. If you haven't had a chance to watch that, first watch this episode, then go back to that one where we looked at the intriguing and fascinating claims of the logical conclusions of naturalistic atheism. And it really doesn't look like a bright future for naturalistic atheism, and where it leads, we can't know anything at all. Knowledge doesn't exist. It's some provocative claims from atheist philosophers, top atheist thinkers, arguing about the logical conclusion of their naturalistic belief. Okay, that was last week's episode. That was a lot of fun. Today, I want to be talking about the authorship of the Gospels, and in particular, looking at and going through together a video, a well-done video by Paulogia. It's about a 22-minute video, and we'll be going through it. I have some PowerPoint slides that I'll be raising some points of concern with the arguments and distinctions that Paul makes, or sometimes he doesn't make, as sort of an implied point. So we'll work through that together. And really what we're looking at isn't so much can we make a positive case for what the identity of the authors is, but rather, does it even matter? Does it matter if we can or cannot identify which person wrote which gospel? So that's not quite the same thing as us trying to figure out who wrote the Gospels. And as Paul videos, there's a lot of great points in this video that Paul has made. And he presents, hey, there are different theories for who that person is. But rather, as we'll get into it, I'll be arguing that it doesn't matter so much if we can or cannot identify which particular person, but rather it's the quality of the content that matters. That's what matters, and I'll get into that. So I suppose without further ado, we'll jump right in. This gentleman, Josiah, is watching along with us, and he's got to dip out in about 30 minutes, he says. Josiah, thanks for joining the live stream today. And let's hop into it. So this is a video at Paulogia's YouTube channel, Who Really Wrote the Gospels. Paul, I hope you're doing well, and would love to schedule another conversation with you, maybe on this subject here, perhaps on some other topic as well. We will jump into it, and the topic for today's show is, does authorship of the Gospels matter?
Comprising the first 4 books of the Christian New Testament, serve as the primary source of information about the life of Jesus. Their reliability is often attributed to the assumption that they were written by eyewitnesses. But who actually wrote the Gospels? How do we know? Let's find out together.
Okay, so Paul does a great job already talking about how the 4 Gospels are seen as the primary evidence for the life of Jesus. I think that's great, no problem there. They're also claimed to be eyewitnesses. Yep, great, okay, no problem there. Notice that's a trait of the quality of the content, that they appear to be written by eyewitnesses. The material is there, whether it's an eyewitness as a first-hand or a second-hand, someone who talked to an eyewitness. That's what I would say. Paul doesn't make that distinction, at least not here. But then he jumps to this idea of identity. Do we really know who wrote them? And that is a distinctive point, and it's a theme that we're going to see throughout this video. And it's a theme I want to bring to your attention, that there is a difference, there's a distinction and a difference between the identity of the content and the quality of the content. And that's a distinction we don't see all that much. And in fact, as we watch this video, we'll see more and more that, well, we can't really know who exactly wrote that work, who exactly put the ink to paper. And so what that does is it's supposed to cast doubt on the quality of the content. But I don't think we need to make that step. So let's continue on. Play on the word holy there. Nice, Paul.
This might seem a strange question when the table of contents of your Bible clearly labels these books: Matthew, a disciple of Jesus; Mark, said to be an assistant to the disciple Peter; Luke, said to be the traveling companion of Paul, a later convert; and John, also a disciple
These
of
are the
Jesus.
traditional
But how do we know
attributions.
that these are the names of the actual authors? Or can we know that? Unfortunately, none of the authors explicitly identify themselves. Within the text, these are anonymous books, entirely without attribution. Now, in the first century, it was not unusual for an author's name to be omitted. The Republic, Parallel Lives, True Histories, and On Abstinence from Animal Food were all anonymous works
And other
in
works.
the same sense from the same era. However, based on external evidence, these are widely accepted as having been written by Plato, Plutarch, Lucian of Samosata, and Porphyry, respectively. Of course, despite speculation, other anonymous works from the time remained unattributed, like Hebrews, the Didache, or the Shepherd of Hermas. But some precedence for anonymous writings doesn't remove the mystery. Indeed, it merely sets the
Okay.
stage, doesn't remove the mystery.
So this is a well-done video by Paul. That's to be expected. He's got experience and work in animation stuff, so great job here. Love the Scooby-Doo. There, even the little sound effect. This is like a 21st century take on what the mystery gang would look like. So nicely done there, Paul.
Indeed, it merely sets the stage. Before delving into the reasons behind attributing these anonymous writings to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, let's first examine when these attributions began to emerge. The earliest surviving document that mentions the names of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John was written around 185 AD. Irenaeus of Rome, known for his extensive work against the heresies, addressed various groups and beliefs he considered to be deviating from Orthodox Christianity. During this time,
Now, if you're a Christian apologist or someone who dabbles in apologetics, you'll wonder why he jumped to Irenaeus and not Papias. He gets into this in a few minutes here.
numerous Gospels were in circulation and used by different churches. Irenaeus declared that only 4 of these are authoritative. Those he names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All the later traditions about gospel authorship trace back to this proclamation.
Okay, now Paul doesn't explain what the rationale was that Irenaeus had for rejecting other gospels, and we'll get into that later because that's important. As I'll later show, if we cannot identify who wrote them, what was the set of criteria that the early church used to accept these documents as authoritative? That's about the quality of content, because that's ultimately what matters. It's the quality of the content, not necessarily the identity of the person who put the pen to paper.
But what about the 100 or so years between the writing of the Gospels and Irenaeus? Is it possible the names were commonly known that whole time? It is true that no manuscripts from this anonymous era contain the names of the authors. For example, manuscript P1 is the earliest extant page 1 of the Gospel now known as Matthew. We know we have the top of the page because we see the character alpha indicating the page number, but there is no title, Gospel according to Matthew, like there is in later editions.
Okay, I want to pause here, and I want to clarify something. Now, I am not a New Testament critical scholar of the transmission of the text. There are plenty of scholars like that. Peter Gurry is a very well-known one, young relative to some others, and I've done some interviews with Peter, both here on Veracity Hill and some other YouTube channels. Peter and I have co-opted talking about Bart Ehrman's work together. But let me talk about P1. So this was raised by Paul here, looking at what's called P1 papyrus. It's a way of categorizing these ancient manuscripts, these fragments even. I do want to talk about this because there's a claim here that Paul makes that, P1 doesn't have the title like later documents does, and that this is the earliest page 1 of the first chapter of Matthew we have. There's actually an argument that there is a contemporaneous fragment. Now, it's categorized under P4, and P4 is really a collection of fragments from Luke, but it includes a fragment of Matthew on its own. So it's not like the backside of Luke. It's a separate fragment, and so a very well-known critical scholar named Simon Gathercole argues that there's a case to be made that it deserves its own P number. So if you were to Google P4 and learn about this collection of fragments, you'll see here actually that there is a flyleaf. A flyleaf was a title page, a cover that says, and it's just the title, The Gospel According to Matthew. It's a title page, so it's not part of chapter 1. It's not the top of chapter 1. It's its own page. And that this dates, well, here's what Gathercole argues. I mean, that the Luke fragments itself date to the same time period. Gathercole argues here that the Matthew fragment, which has been the subject of this discussion, this is from a journal article, is quite clearly the oldest manuscript title of Matthew's Gospel. Indeed, it may even be the earliest extant characterization of Matthew's work as a gospel. Papias mentions Matthew's collection of logia, and the Gospel of Thomas depicts Matthew as an authoritative spokesman. Therefore, Irenaeus and Clement mention the Gospel of Matthew, but our fragment may well be contemporaneous with their florunt, that's Latin word, their blossom, their flowering. Depending on when one dates P66 and P75, our manuscript may even be our earliest manuscript title for any gospel. So while Paul is correct that in this fragment that was collected, P1, it's not, the title is not there. We do have a different fragment found in Egypt that arguably is contemporaneous here to Irenaeus' works. So what's also intriguing about that is that this is in a different geographical region than Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon. So you have here a fuller argument that if Irenaeus in France refers to it as Matthew, and you have a fragment as part of the manuscript tradition elsewhere in the Mediterranean, on the other side, the long way on the other side of the Mediterranean, then you have a good argument here for widespread usage and understanding that it was the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, so that's just, I raise this just to point out that sometimes the truth is complex and it's not always simple. I mean, even, Paul's video here is not so simple. There's a lot to understand, to be understood. And the truth is sometimes even murkier than that. And you have to wade into the details and you have to assess and evaluate so much data. So I just bring up that important point because, again, the truth is murky. And I'm not sure if Paul knew about P4. It would slightly affect, I think, his take here on P1. But let's continue on.
There is no title, Gospel according to Matthew, like there is in later editions. Our earliest page 1 was distributed anonymously. No title. That said, if there were debates about the authorship of the New Testament book of Hebrews among church fathers around the same time, wouldn't we have records of similar debates concerning the Gospels if they were similarly anonymous? And considering the geographical spread of...
Possibly not. I mean, if there was no tradition, even an oral tradition of the authorship of Hebrews, then Hebrews would just be anonymous. There just wouldn't be a tradition that existed that explained and described who the author was.
Christianity and uniform authorship traditions in all regions, isn't that a demonstration that the names would have been attached to the Gospels early on? Well, these are arguments from silence, attempting to draw conclusions based on the absence of evidence rather than the presence of evidence.
And as I argued with one fragment of the collection categorized as P4, it would actually suit Paul's criteria here, that there is evidence, there is hard evidence, we can say. There's hard evidence of a manuscript that exists in a different part of the Mediterranean Sea at the same time as Irenaeus, argues Gathercole.
The earliest manuscript, discovered outside the region of Egypt, dates only to the 4th century, 200 years after the Irenaeus Declaration. Therefore, we simply do not know when the written Gospels began to accompany oral preaching. Similarly, the existence or absence of authorship...
I do want to go back and respond to that. He's arguing here that We don't know when the Gospels, how does he phrase it?
Oral preaching, 7th century, 200 years after the Irenaeus Declaration. Therefore, we simply do not know when the written Gospels began to accompany oral preaching.
We don't know when the written Gospels began to accompany oral preaching. I think there's a strong case that can be made. You can read the Apostolic Fathers, and there are allusions, sometimes even quotations, of the Gospels. The issue with the Apostolic Fathers is that you don't get an explicit naming of which gospel. So that's why there's this, what he calls the era of silence, and it's not till Irenaeus that you receive that. And arguably earlier in Papias, Paul's going to get into that here. The point is, though, that there is a strong case that can be made that the Gospels were read and preached on in the apostolic era. And the simple absence of a name on the Gospels is not indicative that the Apostolic Fathers didn't preach from the texts. So there is evidence that they knew these Gospels, they quoted them, they alluded to them, and so they would have been preaching from them. There's even a case that Paul calls Luke's Gospel Scripture. Paul, now, it's in one of the pastoral epistles, so certain scholars of a persuasion are going to say, well, Paul didn't write the pastorals. Let's just say the later first century Christian community wrote the pastoral epistles. The author therein says, the Scripture says, the laborer deserves his wages. That is from Luke's Gospel only. It's only found in Luke's Gospel. So the author of I think it's 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy, talks about the labor. Scripture says that the laborer deserves the wages. So there's already a recognition here in the New Testament canon, whether Paul himself wrote the pastorals or not.
Similarly, the existence or absence of authorship disputes before Irenaeus cannot be known. If these traditional author defenses are arguments from silence, isn't calling this an anonymous era also an argument from silence? Actually, not at all. During the period of lost manuscripts, we come across numerous influential church fathers who quote from the Gospels,
right,
but do not attribute these quotations to any specific authors like Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John.
Yeah, that's right, Paul. So we've got a good case to be made that there was preaching of the Gospels during this time.
In works such as the Didache, 1 Clement, the Epistle of Barnabas, Ignatius of Antioch's letters to the Ephesians, Smyrnians, Magnesians, and Polycarp, Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, as well as in Justin Martyr's
It's a long
writings,
list.
direct quotations from one or more of the 4 canonical Gospels are found. All of these texts date to at least 120 AD. However, none of these church fathers attribute their quotes to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John.
This is correct.
For instance,
but again, that's not a knock against their authoritative nature. It just means that we don't know the precise identity of the person who put the ink to paper, ancient paper.
Justin Martyr, who provides the most quotations, attributes them all to the Memoirs of the Apostles without specific names attached. The Didache refers to teachings from Matthew as from the Gospel of the Lord. This is not an argument for silence, but rather a positive affirmation of anonymity. If the traditional names were already attached to the Gospels before 120 AD, why would these church fathers refrain from using them to cite their quotations, and even go so far as to use alternate names, especially when they do explicitly credit other authors by name?
Let me say, lest someone get concerned that I'm agreeing here with Paul, what I found in my readings of Bart Ehrman, and I suspect some of what Paul is saying here is also found in Ehrman. You get that in Jesus Interrupted in this chapter, Who Wrote the Bible. I think there's a lot of similarities. Maybe Bart was an influence on Paul here. A lot of what I found in my readings of Bart Ehrman is that it's critiquing of this simpleton view of Christianity. In some cases, a fundamentalist, backwoods fundamentalist interpretation of Christianity. And that's just a critique of that brand or flavor of Christianity. When, as I've studied more Christian theology, the rich Christian tradition, Christian doctrine, Christian apologetics, I have found these distinctions, but yet I've been unpersuaded by these arguments that Ehrman presents as defeaters, or even if they're not presented as defeaters, as if they're presented to cause great doubt. Not just little doubt, but great doubt. Almost bordering on whataboutism. And a similar thing here too. If the Gospels are anonymous in their original writing, that's not a detriment to their quality. And the fact that Paul lists these apostolic fathers and what writings, you can look up these writings themselves and to see how they quoted or alluded to the Gospels, particularly the four Gospels. Not other Gospels written later, but the four Gospels from the first century. Then it demonstrates for the early church that these were the authoritative texts. We're going to get into the criteria, but the point is that even if we can't recognize the identity, that's not a reason for severe doubt on the quality of the work.
Within the same documents, considering that Martyr in particular was contending with heretical challenges, it would have been advantageous for him to utilize the names if the tradition already existed during this time. The most obvious conclusion is that the names didn't exist yet. Now, if the traditional authorship gained acceptance between 120 and 180 AD, why did Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John specifically emerge as the attributed names instead of others? To avoid confusion for the remainder of this video, let's refer to the Gospels as first, second, third, and fourth Gospels based on their order in traditional printings. It is widely believed that the second Gospel was written before the first Gospel, so it's a bit of a Star Wars episode number situation. History can be confusing sometimes.
That's a fun inside joke because Paul used to work at Lucasfilm, so that's a nice analogy he gives there.
Irenaeus' writing in 185 AD provides the earliest known connection between the name Matthew and the book we recognize as the first Gospel. There is an earlier reference from a man named Papias, who wrote approximately 50 to 60 years earlier. Papias authored a 5-volume work called Expositions of the Sayings of the Lord, although no copies of this work have survived. However, there are quotations from this work that have been preserved. In particular, Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in or around 300 AD.
Now, Paul's going to present an argument for why we should be skeptical of Papias using Eusebius' own words. I'll engage with that momentarily.
He reported that Papias wrote, and so Matthew composed the sayings in the Hebrew tongue, and each one interpreted them to the best of his ability. It is upon this sentence that the entire tradition of Matthew's authorship rests.
Oh, Paul, that's not quite right. So you say it is upon this sentence of Papias's that the entire tradition of Matthew's authorship rests. Well, suppose that you didn't have Irenaeus' preservation. Suppose you didn't have Eusebius' preservation, and you only had Irenaeus' work. So you would still depend on a document earlier here that we could point to and support. There is this tradition that exists, and so I think there's more than just merely the idea of Papias' own sentence here that we could look to the evidence, the broad evidence within the Christian tradition. It's not just a single source.
Unfortunately, Eusebius does not provide further context, making it difficult to determine the specific composition Papias was referring to. However, there are clues that indicate it cannot be our first gospel. Firstly, Papias described a collection of sayings akin to a quotation book, while our first...
Yes, that's correct. And Paul, I know you know this, that there's in the scholarship a discussion of Proto-Matthew or M. Now you say Papias describes, so the way you distinguish this work that Papias is talking about is because it's a sayings book, akin to a quotation book. And as I say here, if only scholars have theorized a document of the sayings of Jesus that predates Matthew and Luke, if only there were some document, Paul. Q source. So this is Lycona's view, of course, my friend Mike Lycono holds to the position that what Papias is referring to here qualifies as the Q source. Now, interestingly enough, there's no hard evidence that Q existed. So it's, in that case, it's a theory. I think it's a good theory, though. And there's even further evidence of this Hebrew Matthew gospel. What evidence is there? What other evidence is there? So you have Papias' writings. You also have, in the 4th century, you have Jerome, who wrote a work called The Illustrious Lives. And in that work, I'm forgetting which chapter it is, but he talks about a fellow named Pamphilus. And Pamphilus has collected works at the Library of Caesarea. And one of the works that Jerome has seen with his own eyes, is the Hebrew Matthew Gospel. So you can look this up. Okay, Library Caesarea, Hebrew Matthew Gospel. You could even do a little Google search for Jerome and what he says about it. Jerome has seen this document himself. It's a Hebrew work. So, it did exist. Now, it was destroyed. The library was destroyed in the 7th century by the Muslims, which is unfortunate. But nevertheless, so this document does exist. Now, the question pertains to canonical, what we call canonical Matthew. So let's continue on here and see if I had anything else. Yeah, I'll get into the quality of content in a moment.
First gospel is predominantly a narrative. This genre mismatch is significant, similar to mistaking a map for a diary or a recipe book for a novel.
Right, so what Paul's saying here is you've got this sayings book, but yet canonical gospel has the actions of Jesus, more narrative. So where does this come from? It seems like it's a different work altogether. I don't know that we would say it's a different work altogether. If the sayings work refers to Q, then there could be a sort of second edition by Matthew.
Secondly, Papias stated that Matthew's work was written in Hebrew, but our first gospel is an original, high-level Greek composition, not a translation. Linguists overwhelmingly agree on this point, but for those unfamiliar with ancient Greek, it becomes apparent when comparing lengthy passages where our first gospel matches word for word with our second and third gospels. It would be highly improbable for an English translation of a Spanish language news story to match word for word with the native English report of the same event.
Now that's true, but again, the truth is more complex. Let's suppose Matthean priority in the synoptic problem. If we suppose Matthean priority, then it would make sense that Mark and Luke using Matthew, it would make sense that there would be this commonality between them. So that would resolve the obstacle that Paul's pointing here, but again, we hold to Markan priority. So what's another way we could have this problem solved? Well, if Q source, the Q document, were to have existed, this sayings work, and if then Mark uses Q, if there is this relationship between these sayings work and Q even, which is certainly possible in the synoptic problem quandary, then you would have this common agreement between the triple tradition. So that would resolve the concern here about Matthew and the issue of a proto-Matthew and a canonical Matthew.
Or in this case, two different English language reports simultaneously. Thirdly, Papias also described the death of Judas in an elaborate, exaggerated, and fanciful manner that does not align with the straightforward account in our first gospel. If Papias indeed had access to our first gospel, he did not consider it authoritative. Whatever collection of Hebrew sayings Papias attributed to Matthew, it certainly does not correspond to the work we now recognize as our first gospel. The Matthew known to Papias has been lost to the passage of time. It is curious that some modern scholars would place trust in Papias, considering that those who quote him did not. In the same passage where Eusebius records Papias' claim about Matthew, he also warns that Papias' work includes strange parables of the Savior and statements of a rather mythical character. According to Eusebius, Papias appears to have been of very limited understanding.
I want to address this point here, Eusebius's evaluation of Papias. It's plausible when you go read Eusebius that this quote of his regarding Papias is about Papias' eschatology and his interpretation of the book of Revelation. So I don't know that we can be certain that this is a general evaluation of Papias or if this specific remark is about his eschatology. So you can go look up Eusebius and the section he has on Papias, and you can even see that statement yourself.
Although some assert that Papias had apostolic connections, he himself described his link to Jesus as being, at best, fifth hand, akin to a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend.
All right, let me count here. So you got first hand, the guy in the black coat, second, third, fourth, fifth. Papias would be sixth. Paul, depending on how you're counting, there might be one too many people there. But even still, if this were a chain of custody with Papias, if this oral tradition were passed on, and passed on reliably, what the Orthodox teaching was, even Bart Ehrman admits that there is what we'll call a chain of custody, that there is this passing along of apostolic teaching, and what constitutes as proto-orthodoxy, to use Ehrman's terms, that this chain of custody would be okay, even if there were, multiple people in this line.
Even the very source we have for Papias' account did not consider him reliable, yet it is upon his second-hand and contradictory statement that the tradition of Matthew's authorship is constructed. Unfortunately, questionable Papias is also the source for attributing the writing of a gospel to Mark. When Mark was the interpreter of Peter, he wrote down accurately everything he recalled of the Lord's words and deeds. Mark did nothing wrong by writing some of the matters as he remembered them, for he was intent on just one purpose: to leave out nothing that he heard or to include any falsehood among them. However, if Mark's writing had a singular purpose of being comprehensive, as described by Papias, then our second gospel does not appear to be a strong candidate for Mark's composition. It is significantly shorter and more concise than the other gospels. Without any specific quotations provided by Papias to establish a connection, there is no solid evidence linking the document he described to our second gospel.
Again, you have the apostolic fathers quoting or alluding to Mark and the other Gospels. So you can still recognize that the early church held them as authoritative. Even if the identity, right? There's this conflation that's occurring between, if we can't figure out the identity, therefore we should be suspect of the quality of the content. And I'm drawing a distinction in that conflation, in that grouping together, because we can still recognize them as authoritative and, I would argue, generally historically reliable documents. And given that quality, they're trustworthy. So even if we don't know who exactly wrote these books, we can still view them as trustworthy.
The author of the Gospel of Luke is the only gospel writer who uses first-person language, stating, "I too decided to write," and handed down to us. However, the author never explicitly identifies himself by name, but instead employs pronouns. In the author's second volume, known as the Acts of the Apostles, there are 4 instances where the author switches from using they to we, suggesting personal involvement in some of the Apostle Paul's journeys. However, the author still does not provide his name. It was observed that in Acts, Paul is depicted as bringing the gospel to the Gentiles, and in the letter to the Colossians, 3 Gentiles, Demas, Epaphras, and Luke the physician, are listed as companions of Paul. Since the narratives concerning Demas and Epaphras place them elsewhere, But little is known about Luke's history. The assumption was made that Luke, the physician, could be the author.
Sorry, that wouldn't be an assumption. That would be a deduction. We would deduce that it's Luke. So it's not an assumption. I mean, there's process of elimination that we can make, and looking at the evidence of the travel companions, who they were. And as I argued earlier and raised, one of the pastoral epistles quotes from Luke's gospel. So there's an argument to be made here that there was this familiarity. Now, okay, let's say that you suspect Paul didn't write the pastoral epistles. Let's take 1 Corinthians, where you have the Lord's Supper, Paul describing the Lord's Supper. Here's another distinctive feature that it's an argument that Luke and Paul were companions and close companions, because when Paul describes the Eucharist and the words that Jesus says in the Eucharist, do this in remembrance of me, that is in 1 Corinthians. Do this in remembrance of me, only found in Luke's gospel, not the others. So my own view, and I know I'm a conservative here on this, is an earlier dating of Luke's gospel. You'll grant me 1 Corinthians was written by Paul. Liberal scholars grant that it's genuinely Pauline. We have here close familiarity that Paul has with the teachings of Jesus through Luke's document. That's my view. I know people are going to object to that. I think there's a good case to be made there.
It is important to note that there is no compelling reason for the author of the third gospel would necessarily be limited to the few individuals named in Paul's letters. The majority of early Christians remain unnamed, so the identification of Luke as the author is a relatively arbitrary guess based on a limited number of options.
It's not an arbitrary guess if you can make a deduction.
The traditional attribution of authorship to John for the fourth gospel is
This is a fun one because I know that there's debate over who wrote John.
based on two passages where the author briefly departs from pure third-person narrative. The first passage occurs in chapter 19, during the description of Jesus' crucifixion. The author mentions the presence of 3 Marys and an unspecified disciple Jesus loved near the cross.
Yeah, the beloved disciple. So the author of the fourth gospel commonly refers to himself as the beloved disciple, or the disciple whom Jesus loved.
The author states, "The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe. From this we can deduce that the disciple who witnessed the event gave some form of testimony at some point. However, it is..."
Yeah, that's right. So we have a document which is an eyewitness testimony. The source material of the document. The source material for the document is eyewitness testimony. That's amazing when you think of what sort of person you want to tell you about historical events. Compare it to other works of antiquity. We've got an eyewitness in the first century who talks about the life of Jesus.
It is uncertain
awesome.
whether this book itself is the specific testimony referred to. Additionally, the author does not claim to be this disciple. The narrative remains in the third person, stating, "He testifies, not I testify." The second passage is
Right, but the first person, I and we, between Luke and Acts, I mean, we can't have it. It's like it's a lose-lose for us, Paul, right? I mean, you're going to critique the use of second person, but you're also going to critique the use of first person. I mean, it's a no-win.
found in chapter 21, again referring to the unspecified disciple whom Jesus loved. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. It is possible to interpret writing these things down as referring to the author of the fourth gospel itself, if not for the subsequent sentence. The author explicitly distinguishes between himself and the mentioned disciple. We, the author and the readers, know that his, the disciple's, testimony is true. The identity of the beloved disciple is never disclosed in the text. leading scholars to propose various candidates, including John, the son of Zebedee, Lazarus, Mary Magdalene, James, or even an individual not mentioned in the New Testament. Regardless of who it may have been, the text makes it clear that the beloved disciple is distinct from the author of the fourth gospel.
Now, we should be careful here because I know Paul's going to get this at the end of his video. But suppose that the source material, the person who's responsible for sharing this testimony, for sharing the story, the narrative, the teachings of Jesus, if they had received assistance from a scribe, and the scribe is writing these things down, and the scribe is then sharing their little, we know his testimony is true, would we then say that John or Lazarus is not the author? That's where I've got to give pushback, because it's very common in the ancient world. We'll get into this. I know Paul's going to bring this up later, but it's very common for ancient authors to use scribes. It's common for contemporary authors to use scribes or ghostwriters even, and the person still gets credit for it. So we wouldn't say that they were not the author, rather that it was a co-opt project, and both can receive credit. So that way we could still think it was John, or another favorite theory of mine, Lazarus. We wouldn't say that it wasn't them if they were the source material working with a secretary.
These are the primary reasons cited in support of the traditional authorship, but they are not particularly compelling. Furthermore, there are additional reasons to cast doubt on this attribution.
All right, well, let's take a break here. When we come back, we'll finish going through this video by Paulogia, looking at the reasons why not. He's going to get into their illiteracy. Again, I don't think that's going to be a strong argument. But when we come back, we'll look at this set of 4 criteria that the early church used to recognize their authoritative nature. And we'll also get into the spectrum, or a chart that I've made about scribes, ancient secretaries, and the relationship that a person had with that secretary. So stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill with Dr. Kurt Jarris.
Hi, I'm YouTube.
And I'm Apologetics 315.
Oh, that's nice. What do you do again?
I'm a video hosting platform for Christian apologists.
Oh, you're Christians who apologize for being offensive.
No, that's not what that means.
Oh, I don't like your tone.
My tone?
Oh, I'm sorry. 1 sec. Sorry. There. That'll help you not sound so offensive.
Apologetics315.com, your home for Christian apologetics videos and community.
No one told us we could actually stand on stools. So unfair.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
You're listening to Veracity Hill with Dr. Kurt Jarris.
All right, well, we're back talking about the authorship of the Gospels and whether it even matters if we can identify who, in particular, which person it precisely was that wrote the Gospels. And we're going through a video by Paulogia, who really wrote the Gospels, and looking at his arguments. There's a lot of great material here in this high-quality video, and many of the things that Paul says are correct. They are historical facts. Some of the conclusions he's coming to are correct. Not all of the conclusions that he's coming to, I think, are warranted, though. So we're looking at where those areas are. And before we hop back into looking at the reasons why not Matthew, why not Mark, why not Luke, etc., I want to talk about why the early church recognized these 4 Gospels, not the other Gospels, not the ones that weren't quoted, the ones that the early church, the church leaders, recognized as heretical. What was the set of criteria? If even the apostolic fathers didn't know who wrote these anonymous books, why were they nevertheless seen as authoritative? Well, this criteria comes from Bart Ehrman's book, Lost Christianities. So you don't have to take my conservative, moderately conservative, that's how I self-identify. You don't have to take my moderately conservative opinion on it. You don't have to look at conservative evangelical scholarship on this. Let's just use Bart Ehrman's historically informed position, the criteria that was used to determine canonicity of works. There were 4 points, 4 qualities. Number 1, that the work would be ancient. It was written near the time of Jesus. So this would immediately dismiss 2nd century works, 3rd century works, even in some cases, late 1st century works. You might argue that the Didache was around. The Shepherd of Hermas or Hermas was around. That was not included for a number of reasons, but you look at number 1, ancient, number 2, apostolic, that it was written by an apostle or a companion of an apostle. That was another criteria. 3, Catholic, that there was widespread usage. 4, that it was orthodox, or Ehrman might say proto-orthodox. I'd have to look here. Does he use that term orthodox? Let's see. He does. He just calls it orthodox. Maybe a slip of the Freudian mind by Ehrman there. He doesn't say proto-orthodox. But that it had that same theological character or teaching alongside it in the work itself, that it fit. It didn't sound like other teaching that crept into the church through other sources. So these 4 criterion composed the rationale for why the works were authoritative. So even if you couldn't identify who the author was, like the book of Hebrews, nevertheless, the book of Hebrews is believed to have been divinely inspired and is part of the canon for these reasons. The same is true for the Gospels, that they were written near the time of Jesus, written by an apostle or a companion of an apostle, that there was widespread usage of these 4 Gospels, and that they are orthodox in their teaching. So you have this criteria for why the Gospels were authoritative. So at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if we can't identify which particular persons wrote the work. It doesn't cast a sufficient amount of doubt on their reliability. All right, well, let's jump into this, and then we're going to, as we go through Paul's reasons for why not those particular individuals, we'll also talk about scribes. He's going to address this. I'm not persuaded by his point, but we've got 8 minutes left of Paul's video. Of course, it'll take more than 8 minutes, so bear with me as we continue working through this video of Paul's.
In the 9th chapter of the first Gospel, there is an account of Jesus meeting Matthew, who is traditionally considered the author of the book. However, instead of using his own words to describe this significant event in his life, Matthew simply copies the narrative nearly word for word from the author of the second Gospel, who certainly was not present. Furthermore, Matthew does not place himself in the story. He uses phrases like, Jesus saw a man named Matthew, Jesus told him, and Matthew got up, rather than Jesus saw me, Jesus told me, or I got up. In fact, none of the Gospels are written in first or second person perspective to indicate personal participation in the events. The authors do not claim to be eyewitnesses, nor provide literary hints suggesting that we should consider them as such.
So, the authors don't claim to be eyewitnesses. This is a suspect statement by Paul, because we have to recognize what Paul is meaning to convey here when he talks about the author. He may very well may be talking about the precise person who put the ink to paper. Now, that's different from the source. Let's assume, for now, that there was the use of secretaries. So yes, the secretary would not have claimed to have been an eyewitness, but in the fourth gospel, you do have claims about being an eyewitness. And you have the content itself. I mean, even if there were no explicit claims of being an eyewitness, just look at the content. Does it have verisimilitude? It looks like it's telling the truth. It looks like it's conveying historical details. Of course it does. It looks like these are eyewitness accounts, whether they are firsthand or secondhand. The quality is what matters, not did they say explicitly that they were. So we should judge the material on its own merits rather than our expectations and our own requirements on what we would want had we been there in the first century, what we would have done differently.
Despite the obvious air of legitimacy that this would lend their words. To be fair, writing in the third-person perspective did occur in the first century, as seen in examples like Julius Caesar and Tacitus. However, this was not a prevailing practice and was used for brief stylistic emphasis rather than as an extended narrative convention. The 12 disciples, including Matthew, would have spoken primarily Aramaic, and most likely fell in the 97% of first-century Jewish Palestine who lacked the ability to write in any language, let alone compose literary works in the educated Greek found in the first gospel.
So what you're saying is if they had wanted to write a gospel, they would have needed help. No problem. I got no problem with that conclusion.
In fact, around 155 AD, the church father Justin Martyr wrote, "For from Jerusalem there went out into the world men 12 in number, and these illiterate, of no ability in speaking." Argue that any of them later acquired education would contradict the church tradition still upheld in the 2nd century. While Matthew was known as a tax collector, we should not think of him as a modern-day educated accountant. In Palestine, the position was simple and crude, collection and enforcement, without significant paperwork or need of literacy. There are no known first-century Palestinian residents who were born and raised in that region who wrote books in Greek. It is unlikely that Matthew would have been the first to do so. Apart from the well-known controversy.
Yeah, again, the claim isn't that Matthew himself was the original author of the Greek text. The claim is that there is Proto-Matthew written in Hebrew's language, and that a later sort of second edition comes along. And if this occurred with the help of a secretary, I don't think that we should view this as an issue.
Surrounding the likely added later ending of the second gospel, the beginning of the document is equally contentious among textual critics. Many Bible translations and commentators suggest that the grammatically disconnected first sentence, "the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ," was originally the author's title, rather than the first sentence of the work. Confusion likely arose due to later scribes' formatting choices. If this interpretation is correct, it implies that the second gospel was not initially circulating with the title "The Gospel According to Mark" in its earliest years, as traditionalists often claim. In fact, the phrasing "according to Matthew," "according to Mark," "according to Luke" appears to be a later addition to differentiate the narratives when they began to be collected together.
Yes, that's fair. That's correct. But a few important points here should be made. That of the manuscript tradition, those 4 are the only names that appear in the manuscript tradition. There are not other names in the same works in other manuscripts. So it's not like this is contested in the manuscript tradition. It's not like someone is coming along and saying someone else regarding this same work. Now, there were other gospels out there. Those are different works entirely, though. But there was no debate between 2 different competing camps. Oh, I think this guy wrote it. Oh, I think this guy wrote it. So in the manuscript tradition, there is unanimity.
It would be unnatural to write "the gospel according to me." Some argue that Mark was an obscure figure in the early church, and therefore his name would not have been chosen later to lend authority to the gospel. However, due to limited documentation, we have no concrete information regarding who was well known and who was not. It is worth noting that John Mark is mentioned at least 9 times in the New Testament, which is more frequent than the mentions of the disciple Matthew, who is often considered more famous. The author of the third Gospel, known for having advanced Greek writing skills and Hellenistic cultural references, is commonly assumed,
and who is deemed a historian of the first order in antiquity. Luke's knowledge of history, geography, people is stellar when you compare him to other historians from that era. So you just do an apples-to-apples comparison, and Luke is one of, arguably, if not the best. And the only reason why he wouldn't be deemed the best or of the first order is because, well, he talks about miracles, and of course those don't happen.
to be a Gentile, while an individual named Luke is mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. It is only in a passage from Colossians that he's described as a Gentile. However, it should be noted that the authorship of Colossians itself is a subject of dispute among...
Yeah, but the fact that he's a Gentile, it further bolsters the previous claim made that the earliest followers of Jesus were illiterate. But now you've got Luke, who's a Gentile, who was a physician, and so received some education. Now, Paul's going to argue maybe not the type of writing education. We can have a debate on that. But the point is that actually Luke does seem to fit the bill of someone who could write this work himself. And even if not, he would know someone who knew how.
Among scholars, the single connecting description of Luke as a Gentile becomes subject to doubt, and with it, the assumptions about his authorship. The same problematic passage in Colossians is our only source indicating that Luke was a physician. However, in the 1st century, medical practitioners often required their knowledge through apprenticeships, oral traditions, and practical experience rather than formal education. Learning Greek composition, which took years to master, was not typically associated with medical training during that time. Given the limited lifespan and the demands of acquiring expertise in multiple disparate specialties, the pairing of Greek writing skills and medical training becomes less plausible. Moreover, the portrayal of Paul in the book of Acts, which is written by the same author as the 3rd Gospel, frequently diverges from Paul's self-portrayal in his genuine letters. For example, in Acts, Paul is depicted as immediately going to Jerusalem to meet with the disciples shortly after his vision of Jesus.
All right, let's look this one up. Paul says, Acts 9, Paul is depicted as immediately going to Jerusalem. I am suspect of this. Let's go to Acts 9. I'm using an ESV here. Saul escapes from Damascus. Verse 23, when many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him. But their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him. But his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. And when he had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they were all afraid of him. I could look up the Greek here. Acts 9, interlinear. Let's see what the Greek word here is. Let's do a search for Jerusalem, because that's in verse 26. Okay, so the word is having arrived then in Jerusalem. It's not immediately. So maybe that's the way Paul reads it. It's certainly not required by the language, by the Greek text itself. It's not required to view that as immediately. So it's quite plausible Luke is simply compressing the narrative to fit in various events in a restricted space-time constraint.
However, in Galatians, Paul explicitly states
he goes
that
up to the
he
desert.
did not consult with the disciples after his conversion. These discrepancies, which will be explored in more detail in a future video, cast doubt on the idea that Acts, and by extension the 3rd Gospel, was written by a companion of Paul. Just as it is historically implausible for tax collector Matthew to write a book in Greek, it is even less likely for John, a fisherman from Galilee, to accomplish such a feat. The book of Acts affirms that John was an unschooled, ordinary man.
Okay, if John's unschooled, ordinary, earlier in this video, Paul talks about how there was someone who said, and we know his testimony is true. So the we person or group even are the people who have penned it, put the ink to paper. So again, whether John's unlettered, to use the ancient term, or not, is irrelevant. If he is the source, that's what would matter. You're looking for a source who has eyewitness testimony.
According to church traditions, individuals such as Papias and Polycarp were companions of John the son of Zebedee. However, when examining Polycarp's writings, it is notable that he quotes from the first, second, and third Gospels, but never mentions the one later attributed to his supposed mentor, John. Similarly, Eusebius quotes Papias on the authorship of the first and second Gospels, but remains silent about the one later ascribed to John, who was purportedly his companion. While silence cannot be considered as definitive evidence, it does raise curiosity and questions.
Yeah, but curiosities and questions are curiosities and questions. It's not doubt or even stark doubt. All right, so he's going to get it to a note on secretaries. Before we get into those final 2 minutes, let's ask this question. Does the identity of the person with the pen matter? It's an intriguing curiosity. It doesn't mean that we should question the whole work itself. There are plenty of works from antiquity that had use of secretaries. And there's a great work here by Randy Richards called Paul and First Century Letter Writing. Now, this deals just with Paul and letter writing. It doesn't deal with other narratives, bigger works. Paul's Paulogia is going to get into that. And nevertheless, it's a nice little book if you want to learn more about the industry, the business of being a secretary. And Richards even describes and has photos of ancient workshops. These were shops that people could go to. I mean, so it was this whole little industry of being able to write to someone. If you were illiterate but you wanted to write a letter to someone, you had to use a secretary. Now, Richards has this, I've created this chart. He's got 3 categories for types of secretaries. And he also is quite clear multiple times that these categories can bleed over into each other. These aren't hard and fast groups. So on one side of the spectrum, you have a transcriber, someone who just takes dictation, basically, and the person will tell them what to write and they will write it. Then you have someone who could be a contributor, someone who offers edits. And these could be very minor edits. These could also be major edits, so that there would be a lot of literary license that the secretary could take on behalf of the person that commissioned them. And in the third category, you have a composer, someone who might entirely take up the project. They would be commissioned by someone to write, in Richard's book, you're talking about letters. So the person would be commissioned to compose the letter. They might be given instructions on what to do, but it's not like there'd be hand-holding going on. And the person who commissioned the letter would still get the credit as the author, even though there was an ancient secretary that they used. Now, there's good reason for thinking that a composer might go through a first or even second draft or more, depending upon if the person that commissioned them approved the work or not. So even with Paul's letters, you have composers. You have secretaries. Tertius is mentioned in Romans. You see this, that Paul very likely did this. There's evidence he did it. There's evidence that there's times when he wrote with his own hand. See what big letters I'm writing with. So Paul used ancient secretaries. And so it's plausible that other works as well were written by the use of secretaries in one form or fashion along this spectrum, whether it be a transcriber or contributor or even a composer. Perhaps, I would argue, probably not full-on composer, but a contributor, someone who edited. You might think maybe even transcriber in some cases. But would that pose as an issue to the identity of the person, or that they would be untrustworthy. Well, let's talk about, you go from ancient to modern secretary. We can still use modern secretaries. We use ghostwriters. Politicians have staff that write speeches for them, that write articles published in newspapers. And guess whose name goes on the byline? The politicians, not the staffers. So we still use secretaries in this same way, and people still get the same credit. So the issue is not the precise identity, but the quality of the content. Who is the source material? That's what matters, not who exactly put pen to paper. So if an evangelist was illiterate, it doesn't matter. It wouldn't matter if they were illiterate if they had used a secretary, because then they would still be the source. So the arguments that Paul just gave about illiteracy, for example, I think are irrelevant to the case of whether the Gospels are trustworthy sources. All right, let's deal with his note on secretaries here.
While the idea of illiterate individuals using secretaries to write their Gospels is not implausible, a systematic study on the usage of secretaries in antiquity found no evidence of secretaries taking dictation in one language and translating it into another, or being given instructions for a lengthy narrative and then composing it themselves. There are no analogous instances supporting such a scenario. It would be a unique and unlikely occurrence.
All right, well, again, if the Christian community had learned of this testimony, they could help someone to go to a secretary who may have been bilingual and who could have written a letter in Greek from an Aramaic speaker. So the use of the secretary, if the secretary knew the languages, wouldn't be an issue. Again, wouldn't be an issue for Paul. Who is Paul? Paul is the tribe of Benjamin. Paul is a Jew. He's a Jewish Christian, but he's a Jew. He knows and studied Hebrew. He was well read. He wrote in Greek. He used secretaries in Greek. So the argument that there's a language barrier, I don't think that's a good argument. Now, in terms of the comparison from antiquity, I'd have to look. He cites Ehrman. I'd have to look at Ehrman's claim. Some of Ehrman's popular works are different, and I have found in some cases Ehrman can make some exaggerated, hyperbolic statements or claims. Let me give you one example of that. When Ehrman, in this work, Jesus Interrupted, talks about who wrote the Bible, he talks about eyewitness testimony. And he says some things here that I'll read that are just wrong if we are to interpret Ehrman rigidly. So he talks about here about eyewitness testimony. This is page 103 in the chapter Who Wrote the Bible. Why did the tradition eventually arise that these books were written by apostles and companions of the apostles? In part, it was in order to assure readers that they were written by eyewitnesses and companions of eyewitnesses. An eyewitness could be trusted to relate the truth of what actually happened in Jesus' life. But the reality is that eyewitnesses cannot be trusted to give historically accurate accounts. They never could be trusted and can't be trusted still. I'm sorry, what? All right, here's the rationale he gives. If eyewitnesses always gave historically accurate accounts, we would have no need for law courts. If we needed to find out what actually happened when a crime was committed, we could just ask someone. Real-life legal cases require multiple eyewitnesses because eyewitness testimonies differ. All right, so you see there's some logical distinction in Ehrman's own thought here. That is, they're illogical distinctions. He says that eyewitness testimonies, they could never be trusted and can't be trusted still. That is, on the surface, false, because in a court of law, eyewitness testimony is counted as evidence. And eyewitness testimony is generally reliable, even if we can't always. Notice that's in the next sentence. He says, if eyewitnesses always give historically accurate accounts. We're not claiming that eyewitnesses always gave historically accurate accounts. We just expect eyewitness testimony to be generally reliable. And that's all we need as a starting point, that eyewitness testimonies are generally reliable. So for Ehrman to say The reality is that eyewitnesses cannot be trusted to give historically accurate accounts. They never could be trusted and can't be trusted still. Those are Ehrman's own words, and they are, on the surface, incorrect. So I'd have to look at, I think he quoted from Forged there. I'll have to look at that statement about other works from antiquity and the use of secretaries. Now, I will say that Richards does provide examples from Cicero talking to his secretary, writing to his secretary, and it does appear that the secretary's name was Tiro, if I remember correctly, was quite involved with Cicero's writings. Quite involved. And not just with regard to letters, it appears. So again, I'd have to evaluate that claim, but that'll be fun to look at.
Considering the available evidence, the most reasonable conclusion is that after nearly a century of anonymous circulation and nameless quotation, when competing apocryphal gospels with authoritative sounding names like Gospel of Thomas and Gospel of Peter began to emerge in the 2nd century, the early church felt compelled to attach names to the existing Gospels. This was done to differentiate them from the newly emerging texts and to counter heresies by attaching authority to their favorite texts.
Attaching authority, the works were already authoritative for the Orthodox community. So they're not adding authority to them. So even if the names were ascribed, it was a helpful way of distinguishing which Gospels were being quoted or referred to. So yeah, they wouldn't be attaching new authority because the authority was already there. That's why the Apostolic Fathers quoted them and alluded to them, because they were authoritative, and these other ones were not.
With names already associated with other Gospels, the logical choice was to attribute the 4 canonical Gospels to 2 disciples of Jesus and the traveling companions of the influential figures Peter and Paul.
But it's not like this was out of the blue or in a vacuum. There was reason. You might even say oral tradition. In Luke's case, there's better than an oral tradition. And again, the attribution of names to the documents was not random, and it wasn't even arbitrary. So if Paul is suggesting that it was arbitrary, that would not be a historically accurate assessment of how and why the names were attributed to their respective works.
While we may never definitively know the true authors, it is highly unlikely that Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John wrote the Gospels attributed to them.
Wait, let's do this again. What was that last line?
Definitively know the true authors, it is highly unlikely that Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John wrote the Gospels.
But why would we think that? That means you would have to be able to evaluate the likelihood of other people having been the authors themselves. So now if you're saying, well, because there was a secretary, okay, but we want to know what the source material is. That's the author. That's the person that gets credit, the person who provides the source material. So to say it's highly unlikely that they were the source material, that's a probability formula I'd like to see. Again, I don't want to go all Bayesian probability. We can, but I know that we're just getting in the weeds on that. But if Paul had a way of providing an argument for the high probability, high likelihood here that it wasn't those people, I don't think that probability would be as high as he thinks it is. All right, well, so that finishes it up. So does authorship of the Gospels matter? Yes and no. Yes, with regard to the quality of the content, it does matter in this respect. What is the source material? Those would be the credited authors of the material. But no, the authorship of the Gospels doesn't matter with regard to the identity of the person that put the ink to ancient paper. We don't need to know precisely, hey, it's cool that we know Tertius wrote Romans. I mean, Paul gets the credit. There's no dispute there, even among liberal scholars. But Tertius actually wrote it. So would you say Paul didn't write it? No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't make that logical misstep. And likewise with the evangelists, with the Gospels, you shouldn't make that same misstep. So we want to know who the source was. So again, what you see here is this conflation of the identity of the content with the quality of the content, and we shouldn't make that conflation. Rather, we need to keep those distinct as we evaluate the arguments for whether the Gospels are trustworthy documents. Well, that does it for the show today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons. Those are folks that just chip in a few bucks each month. If you have benefited from this program, either watching on YouTube or listening to it on our podcast, and you've found yourself benefiting from this, would you consider becoming a monthly partner with us? You can do so at veracityhill.com/donate and click on that partners. You could give a free will offering, a one-time gift, or you could consider partnering with us on a monthly basis. Really grateful for the partnerships that we have with our patrons. Also, the partnerships with our sponsors. They are Defenders Media, Apologetics 315, and Rethinking Hell. I want to thank our tech guru, Gabe, for all the fine work that he does on the program week in, week out. And last but not least, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on the authorship of the Gospels.
This has been Veracity Hill, a viewer and listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.